Afternoon. Welcome to the final episode of Catapult Podcast on demystifying Microsoft's cloud vision for Dynamics, hosted by Microsoft Dynamics World. My name is Elliot Fishman, CEO of Catapult. We're a Microsoft partner focused on ERP and CRM implementation, support, and managed services. I'm joined by my colleagues Jeff Bacon, Vice President of Client Development, and Dan Ditomaso, Infrastructure Consultant based out of Toronto, Canada. Last episode, we talked about Dynamics 365 in detail. So today, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to do the same for Microsoft Azure. We're going to learn what it is, how to differentiate it from other web services and cloud services offerings on the market, and what you need to know before thinking about migrating any of your solutions to Azure. So let's get started. Afternoon, Jeff and Dan. How are you guys this afternoon?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm great.
Yeah, pretty good.
Excellent.
Dan, how are you? How are things in Toronto?
Very well, yes. Thanks for asking.
Staying warm?
Yes, it's a little chilly here, but overall, it's pretty cold here.
Yeah, good. Well, I don't know, another few months of winter. All right, let's dive in. So we're going to talk about Microsoft Azure. We've mentioned this in one of the previous episodes. We distinguish it Microsoft's private cloud offering for infrastructure and hosting and computing, but it's so much more than that. There's a lot there. Also, potentially a lot of confusion in the market about what exactly it is. So I think I'll start with that question, and maybe to you first, Dan. What exactly is Azure, and who is it for?
Well, that's a great question. So Azure can be misunderstood by some people, but to your point about who's it for, it's really just for everyone. It can be from the single developer in a startup, who wants to make a video game and develop it using cloud technologies, all the way up to large enterprise, the 500 to 1,000 plus companies out there, to Fortune 500. So it kind of spans the whole array of companies out there. But to your question about what Azure really is, and there are a lot of different services out there in the marketplace that do kind of that use the word cloud, but Azure is truly a cloud offering. So Microsoft Azure is a cloud offering that started around 2010, and it's been built up ever since as a product. It started out with just a few things, so you can at a very high level, you can move things like your virtual machines, you can move your SQL databases and other components of your enterprise to the cloud. You can kind of lift and shift them into the cloud, and then run them in essentially a data center that's managed by Microsoft instead of running it on premise. So that's really a high level summary of what Microsoft Azure, really is. It's a cloud based data center that's essentially you're paying for on a per hour or per day or annual budget, and it lets you lift and shift your applications to the cloud and elastically scale them if you need.
Great, thanks,
Yeah,
Jeff. What are your thoughts? How would you answer that question? What is Azure?
I think that's great. Without getting into all the detail, because there's new capabilities on Azure every day, I'd agree with what Dan said, but I'd also add that it's not only is it for kind of everybody publicly, but it's also for Microsoft themselves. In order to host their applications that they're running as a subscription service. So the D365 offerings, the Office 365 offerings, all of the other cloud-based services that they're putting out there, it's a way for Microsoft to actually start to consume their own services. So it's basically a platform not only for Microsoft to offer public offerings, but it's also kind of on the flip side, customers who want to put their things in the cloud to run on that particular environment. So it's all encompassing.
So are you saying then that Microsoft hosts Dynamics 365 solutions and Office 365 solutions, which are, we discussed, SaaS solutions on Azure as well?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the platform they leverage. Just more in a I wouldn't even say enterprise. I'd say on a massive scale. That's exactly what they're doing.
Great. And so, when we think about cloud, there's a whole bunch of terminology that, that a couple of acronyms that have popped up. We've all heard of SaaS, software as a service. We've also heard IaaS, infrastructure as a service, and then there's platform as a service. Where does Azure stack up? How does it fit into all of this? Is it all of them or just one of them? Dan?
Yeah, I think it is actually all of those. It can be initially when Azure was launched, it was very much an IaaS offering. So you'd build a virtual machine in Azure, and that was your IaaS kind of offering. But then they expanded that from originally, to Jeff's point, they originally offered a precursor to what is now known as Office 365 called BPOS, which is the Business Productivity something suite.
Office Suite.
And it was hosted on Azure's cloud as well when it was announced and when it was released in 2010. But yeah, they've really expanded the platform to encompass, now Office 365 to, as well as Dynamics 365 SaaS offerings. They've expanded it to also scale at their PaaS offerings, things like Azure SQL databases and other related kind of PaaS offerings. So it's all three right now. It's moving at such a rapid pace. It's great.
Interesting. So Jeff, would you say that Azure is a feasible platform or solution for customers to manage their entire computing and information technology infrastructure?
Yeah, for sure. Going back to our kind of previous question and what we said before, in that you can I guess subscribe to Microsoft services, being D365 sales or service or finance and operations, and in addition to that, Office 365. You can provision all of that on Azure. And then in addition to that, if you have other things that Microsoft doesn't actually, kind of cover in their application suite, you can host the virtual environments that those applications run on in Azure, and then integrate them through Azure AD services. So the reality is there's a way to actually move everything in an organization's kind of IT ecosystem into Azure and run everything in the cloud. So I'd say, yeah, absolutely. It's a good strategy. Again, if you have kind of a Microsoft affinity, or that's the way you want to run, or the platform you want to run on, Azure is a great way to go for sure.
Yeah, and even to your point, Jeff, even if your affinity is to Azure. You can also look at scaling your current cloud to other offerings. So you could become multi-cloud, things like using part of your environment on Amazon and part of it on Azure, because it's all interconnected through the internet.
Yeah, for sure.
Great. Let's dive a little deeper into how Azure can be used by customers who are running Microsoft Dynamics. So now we did talk about Microsoft Dynamics 365 already. Jeff, you clarified that 365 runs on Azure. Now, what about for other scenarios? For example, you have an investment in an on-premise ERP system like Microsoft Dynamics Nav. Is that a good use case for a migration to Azure? For those Dynamics customers who are listening today, how would Azure be relevant in their businesses, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. So how would Azure be? So Microsoft really has addressed this point really well by being able to focus on their long game, the long-term play with Azure, and they've developed something called the hybrid cloud, and that's a kind of unique term to Microsoft. They initially, when they offered Azure, they thought, okay, well, everyone's going to just move to Azure, but I think they realized as they've been working with customers and listening to feedback, they realized that customers don't want to just pick up all their VMs and move them into the cloud and that's it. They want to keep some assets on-premise for a number of reasons. So Microsoft's made some really heavy investments in something like, as I mentioned, a hybrid cloud, and that really allows you to keep some of your workloads on-premise and some you can move to the cloud. Dynamics is a perfect application to migrate to an Azure hosted environment or another cloud provider. It really makes a lot of sense to pick up like a Dynamics CRM or Dynamics Nav type application and move that into the cloud. So those are two really great candidates. Others might be SharePoint and some other ones, but an Exchange can now be removed from your environment, and you can now shift that into Exchange Office 365. So there's some really great quick wins you can make with moving your application into the cloud, but through the advantage of being running in Microsoft Azure Cloud, you can extend a lot of the on-premise technology you have into the cloud, and then have interconnectivity with minimal footprint in Azure. So you can kind of choose whichever works for your business.
Sounds like a great alternative to the on-premise server room.
Yes.
So, Jeff, if I'm a customer thinking about with an investment in Microsoft solutions or Microsoft Dynamics solutions, should I be thinking only about Azure, or should I also be thinking about offerings like Amazon Web Services or Google Web Services? How does that Azure differentiate from those?
I'll let Dan kind of talk to the technical differences, but from my perspective, just like Microsoft is focused on and has always been focused on the corporate user. That's really where I'd say that their bread and butter is, and that's where the Azure is really kind of seeing a lot of use cases, and that's the differentiator between Amazon and Google, where Amazon's really looking to power massive e-commerce type companies. Google Web Services seem to be more individuals or kind of small enterprise or small business to get onto the Google platform. But where Microsoft again plays is, if you've got existing infrastructure, if you've got existing licenses, if you understand how Microsoft works in the corporation, which is, I would say 95% of the world, platforming on the Azure cloud is really kind of the way to go, simply because everything's familiar, everything works. It actually is leveraging the existing infrastructure that you're currently used to working with, only it's provisioned in the cloud with a bunch of really cool technology, which I'll let Dan speak to a little bit in terms of differences. But really, if you're looking and you're a business, you're used to running Microsoft, it is really, I think, the platform of choice in the cloud world.
Dan, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so there's some really, I think, unique differences that Microsoft brings to the table when you decide to go with something like Azure versus one of the competitors like Google or Amazon. License mobility is one of the brand new features they brought out in just late 2016, early 2017, and that allows you to essentially take your on-premise licenses and move them into the cloud, and then receive savings on your hourly usage of VMs. So essentially, instead of renting a license through Microsoft, you can bring your license with you. And that's one of the really unique offerings to Microsoft. And if you think of that, how it scales across 100 plus virtual machines or the number of databases you might have in the cloud, it can really save you some significant operating costs. That's really unique. That's one of the huge unique offerings that Microsoft brings to you. But yeah, I think that, like I said earlier, I think Microsoft's in it for the long game. We see that they've got these almost Trojan horse applications like Office 365 and Dynamics 365, and they might introduce one of those to an enterprise, and the customer will become used to that application, and through that usage of Dynamics 365 or Office, they will then start using additional applications like Flow or some of the other Azure kind of unique offerings.
Interesting. So you mentioned license portability and some opportunities for Microsoft customers who have investments in existing licenses to save on, to get some cost benefit on the Azure platform. But what about, and I think it's come up earlier in the discussion, you guys have both referenced this sort of pay-as-you-go kind of model where it sounds like it's kind of a utility-based pricing where you pay for what you consume, as long as the meter is running. What is, from a customer point of view, am I going to save money in the long run moving my workloads from on-premise infrastructure to Azure? If I'm a Dynamics Nav customer, for example, and I'm running on local servers, or let's say I'm even running on a local hosting partner, long term, are there cost advantages to me? Am I going to save money, Jeff?
There could be. It really shifts the attention onto those particular workloads. And what I mean by that is, in the past, you can just buy terabytes of storage and just keep on storing your data, for example. In the cloud, data is a cost driver. So the more storage you have, actually, the more expensive it becomes. So if you think about that in terms of cost savings, just on a apples per apples basis, you have to be, I'd say, a little more thoughtful in terms of how you're storing data. But in addition to that, it actually forces customers in the cloud-based world to actually think a little bit more about their data. How are they backing it up? How are they storing it? How are they archiving it? Maybe even how they're compressing it, and how are they actually dealing with it? So I wouldn't say there's necessarily cost savings versus on-premise, but I think there are certain advantages to having it in the cloud-based model, simply because it is a cost driver, for example. But there are other things that you would, I think, and Dan, you probably are more familiar with this than me, but I think you would save money on in terms of provisioning other resources, things like virtualization, for example, and just the general resources available to run your server-based technology is available, and it is like literally like a couple bucks per month. So there are really inexpensive things, but there are also more expensive things that I think will help to drive more efficiency in the cloud-based model or on Azure. And Dan, you can probably speak to certain cost advantages based on your knowledge in a little more detail.
Well, if I could just jump in for a second, it sounds to me like cost savings might be a benefit, and there may be some ways to trim a little bit of cost, but maybe there are other benefits in terms of things like, Dan, what would you have to say about things like reliability versus on-premise, scalability, or security? I mean, certainly, I know for our customers are always interested in IT infrastructure security, and with with the increasing news reports of high profile hacking incidents, what can customers expect in those dimensions?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're really seeing with, regardless of the cloud provider, if it is Azure, Microsoft's been introducing new features to deal with these types of recent hacks that have been popular in the news. Things like Azure Security Center is really they're really pushing as a kind of a single dashboard that users that administrators can reference on a daily basis or hourly basis, and they can watch as it combines things like Azure Advisor, which reviews kind of best practices and applies them to your workloads that are running in your subscription, and then tells you about how to improve your security posture and what you can do to fix that. But to your point about can you be more secure by keeping your things on premise? That's a really tough question to answer at this point, and I think that the ultimate answer is you can achieve higher reliability by moving your workloads to Azure, because reliability costs a lot of money. High availability costs a lot of money, and those are things that are democratized when you run in a cloud environment. You can buy a load balancer. Actually, a load balancer in Azure is free, so you can automate. Whereas a load balancer, if you were to buy it on premise, can be tens. Or can be thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, depending on models that you choose. So from that perspective, availability and reliability can be increased through democratization of the resources that are used to back up your data, to move it to an offsite data source. These are things that customers have always thought about, but they're literally just through a point-and-click interface when you're inside the Azure cloud.
Mm-hmm. And tell me, I've heard this term geo-redundancy in the context of Azure a few times, which I think means replicating data from one of these many football field sized data centers to another one in a different part of the world to mitigate against various kinds of physical risk and that sort of thing. Is that true? Is that a benefit to customers? Is there more reliability? Can I sleep at night better knowing that my servers are running on Azure infrastructure, and that they're less likely to experience some sort of disaster type scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. Even in the lowest redundant storage model that Azure offers, they don't offer anything below a model called LRS, which is local redundant storage. And LRS still is written to three different hard disks, SSDs or hard disks, around a single data center. So that's inside a single data center, whether in North America, for example. And even at the minimum level, you're still getting three different hard disks that are recording your data every time. So you have, I don't offhand remember what the reliability is, but it is. Oh, it's actually, I had a chance to just look it up here. It's 11. It's 99 with 11 nines after it. So it's total of 11 nines of durability, which is just unheard of in reliability terms. Normally, customers want 4 nines uptime or 5 nines, but getting 11 nines of uptime is just 99 with 9 nines after. It's just insane. And that's at the LRS level.
That is a lot of nines.
That's a lot of nines.
Yeah.
When you move up to the GRS model, which is one of the higher tiers of it's a little more expensive per gigabyte, but you get 16 nines of reliability, which is just insane. So what essentially that means is that your data is replicated to a secondary region that is hundreds of miles away. So a good example is here in Canada, we have two Azure data centers. One is in approximately Toronto and one's approximately around Montreal. And they are replicated, second by second. The data is moved over private lines to the other Azure data center, and it's also encrypted as it travels over those private fiber optic lines. So your data is secure not only when it is in the Azure data center, but also in transit and at rest.
Sounds like a pretty reliable server room. I've also heard about an SLA that Microsoft offers. Jeff, do you know anything about that in terms of what Microsoft offers to customers aside from claims about 11.9s and 16.9s? Is there some sort of accountability that Microsoft guarantees? What happens if something does go wrong?
Yeah, I last time I checked, I haven't really dug into this during bedtime reading or anything like that, but certainly last time I read about it, it was 99.9% uptime. And in addition to that, if it is proven that Microsoft causes a business interruption, they will actually write you a check based on what your business interruption is. So to me, that's a pretty damn good SLA. In addition to that, there's a bunch of other layers to it in terms of data security, data access. There's also other things that are kind of under that umbrella around the SLA. That again, if anybody cares to read about it, be more than happy to pull up some of the websites where it's posted. But the key point is it's publicly posted, and they are striving to do that, and they stand by it. So I think having a server in a server room, you'll never get that level of service.
Right. Yeah. Sounds like a great solution all around. Let's just shift as we sort of move into the closing segment of our podcast today. I'd like to just explore what some of your experiences have been with in working with Dynamics customers migrating their solutions to Azure. So we've talked about what's possible. What's the experience been? Our customers, is it easy? Is it expensive? Is it does the end result justify the means, and do customers experience the same level or better performance in Azure than they did with their on-premise infrastructure? Let me start with you, Jeff, as I know that you're sort of working with clients at the account level, and then we'll switch to you, Dan, because I know you've had some real hands-on experience with this. Jeff.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, yes, clients do have that same level of performance. But that said, it does force us to be a little more mindful of how we are deploying Azure-based solutions. In the past, we didn't necessarily have to think about anything to do with latency or user experience. I think I covered this in a previous podcast. Now they're building out cloud-based deployments. We definitely have to think about how we are deploying, and a little bit about kind of the pages and how they're displayed in terms of data coming through. Most importantly, however, though, we definitely do have to think about latency, and if we're hosting something in a data center in Toronto, for example, we may not want to just have a typical deployment using a fat client here and a server there. We want to think about how we deploy via RDP, or maybe even using the web client, so that we're getting the least amount of data moving back and forth over the line. Or alternatively, the client has really, really fat pipes somehow. And I know, Dan, we've talked about this a few times internally, but there are options around that as well. If there's lots of data moving through, there is something called ExpressRoute, which is an offer from Azure that is kind of a priority lane, so to speak, over the internet to that data center. So to answer your question, the experience has been good, but it has forced us to up our game a little bit internally to thinking about things that we haven't thought of previously when we're deploying behind the firewall.
Thanks. Dan, now you've worked on a number of Azure migrations, particularly for Microsoft Dynamics Nav. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and maybe some of the key lessons that you've learned, and maybe impart a bit of advice to our listeners about how they ought to approach their migrations and certainly the questions that they should ask of their partners?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of I think you really need to take a holistic approach to looking at any sort of cloud migration, whether it's an Azure database. Even if you're picking that up and moving into the cloud, you still need to take a holistic approach to how you're going to pick up that application and migrate it into the cloud. I think that there's a lot of things, and Jeff spoke to a few of those. Bandwidth is definitely one of the primary drivers. No longer is everything just down the hall in the server room. It's now in a data center tens to hundreds of miles away that you do need to think about. There is a physical limitation on your latency that you might need a private offering offering called ExpressRoute, which is, as Jeff mentioned, kind of a high speed private connection into an Azure data center. But yeah, so I think, getting back to my point, I think you need to take a holistic approach to how you decide to what to kind of deal with first in your cloud migration. Obviously make sure you have enough bandwidth. That's if you have a 5 megabit connection and you're connecting from Vancouver to Toronto, that might be a bit of a problem. So, work with your telco, work with your ISP or your partner, your qualified partner, and address those as part of your project tasks. Other things to think about are there is a good chance that as you do your migration, there will be some downtime, so you do need to have some planning around that. At current application dependencies, so if you're running Dynamics Nav on premise and it integrates with a warehousing application, think about how that's going to work across the internet. Is there going to be an additional latency that's going to be introduced? These types of things are really important to kind of consider ahead of while in the planning stages prior to even touching the keyboard or even getting into Azure. These things need to be discussed and thought through, and that's where we've really we developed our breadth of experiences, understanding at a high level what and even at a low level, understanding what these interconnectivity items are and how to address them.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think one of our key learnings was in the past, very often infrastructure was the domain of the client, which means, hey, you've got a box and you got wires and you can get all the resources you need. So here's the spec. Now please add these resources in order for the application to work. Now it's part of our domain. It's part of what we need to do. So whenever we're looking at implementing a solution or even migrating a solution, infrastructure or the Azure-based services has to be part of that solution design. Otherwise, it just becomes an afterthought, and then we're trying to make it work afterwards. So anybody out there trying to or looking at Azure, make sure you've got a thoughtful solution design for your Azure services and how it's going to work with that implementation up front instead of just trying to cobble it together.
Great. Well, guys, I think this brings us to the end of our podcast journey on Microsoft Cloud Services and Microsoft Dynamics in particular. I want to thank Jeff and Blair and Dan for sharing your time and your perspective. I know I've learned a few things about Microsoft's Cloud Services for Dynamics. I'd also like to thank Jason and Dan at Microsoft Dynamics World for hosting our first podcast series, and a shout out also to our producer, Simon. If you've enjoyed the discussion and you have any questions or you have any topic suggestions for another podcast, you can certainly reach out to me directly at Elliot, ELLIOT, at catapulterp.com. We hope it's been enjoyable for you, certainly as enjoyable as it has been for us to put this together. We look forward to speaking to you next time. And until then, don't forget to check out our blog for ERP and CRM insights, www.catapulterp.com. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.